This is my channel, The Fancy Hat Lady Reads. I am wearing my fancy booktube hat. I am also wearing even more semi-artsy campaign buttons because tomorrow, as I am filming this, is our American election here, and if you are able to vote in it and have not already, you absolutely must vote. But today I'm bringing you my wrap-up for the month of October. I hope you all had a happy Halloween. I dressed up as a fairy godmother and I handed out candy in my apartment building. My apartment building gets a good number of trick-or-treaters, so I handed out a lot of candy. I carved pumpkins. I get really into artsy pumpkin carving. And so the pumpkins I did this year were a Cinderella carriage, which I'm really proud of, and a masquerade mask, because I like to theme my pumpkins with my costumes, and I was really pleased with it and I wanted to share the photos. Okay, so I read 6 books in October. 2 of them have already gone back to the library. 1 of them I've already done a review on. 1 of them I will do a review on. And 2 of them were for Own Voices October, which was a month-long readathon event hosted by Katie from the channel Katie Loves to Read and Mel from the channel Books with Wings. The goal was just to try to read some Own Voices books in the month of October. So I thought I would start with those books here, even though I read these books more towards the end of the month, and I usually go through my wrap-ups in the order of when I read them. I thought I would feature these books first. So the first book I read for Own Voices October was Lagoon by Nnedi Okorafor. This is a sci-fi fantasy aliens land first contact story that takes place in Lagos, Nigeria. Nnedi Okorafor is an African-American SFF author, and her work is frequently based in her Nigerian heritage. I read her novella Binti, and I was impressed enough by it that I'm planning on reading the sequel when it comes out. There is going to be a sequel to Binti. I thought there were things about Lagoon that were really interesting, but it didn't grab me as much as Binti did. I know that Katie at Katie Loves to Read also started reading this during Own Voices October, and we were discussing it a little bit on Voxer. I think she may have ended up DNFing it. We were both feeling pretty lukewarm on this when we checked in at about like the halfway mark. It is a very strange book. There were things that actually got weirder in the second half that I found interestingly compelling for me. But if you like your alien landing stories to be more straightforward, this might not be for you. I've heard this pitched a bit as sci-fi with magical realism. I think that works a bit to describe it. I think the book as a whole is more concerned with drawing a portrait of the people and culture of Lagos than it is with the actual semi-benevolent alien invasion. The first large chunk of the book mostly focuses on how the news that the aliens are here gets out. Basically, we follow 3 protagonists who are drawn into the sea to meet with the aliens when they first arrive on the beach. The aliens are sort of these inexplicable magical shapeshifters, and these 3 characters take one of them back with them. They try to, I guess, introduce her to humanity, but then things predictably go all wrong. There's a lot of emphasis on what different types and groups of people think they can personally gain from aliens landing in Lagos. The main characters are a marine biologist, a rapper, and a soldier. It's not initially clear why these 3 people have been chosen, as it were. I spent like the first half of the book wanting it to get like either way more fantastical or like more scientific or possibly more philosophical or something. I couldn't get a feel for like where this was going as an SFF story. There were things I liked towards the end though. There was some folklore stuff that was brought in that I really liked. I wish there had been more of it because that's like my stuff that I like. It does eventually become clear sort of what it is that's special about these 3 characters. The aliens, though, never really get a proper explanation. They're sort of admittedly there just to instigate stuff. And that was a little odd. So if you like your aliens to be more thoroughly explored, this might not be for you. I did think this was a good book for me to read for Own Voices October, though, because I've never read a book that takes place in Nigeria, and I knew absolutely nothing about the culture of Lagos, and I think this was actually a very good book for that. I gave this 3 stars. Compared to Binti, I gave 4 stars, and I already mentioned that I'm going to be probably reading the sequel to Binti. I justify giving this 1 fewer star because I feel like if there were to be a sequel to this, I wouldn't feel so compelled to read it. The second book I read for Own Voices October was actually the last book I think I finished in October, and it's a November release. It's Of Fire and Stars by Audrey Coulthurst. This is a standalone young adult fantasy novel with a female-female romance at the center of it. I did some digging to make sure that this is Own Voices, and I'm pretty sure that it is. I am going to be doing eventually a full Goodreads review on this, as well as a video review. It might end up being a double review with another book, so I'm going to be quick about this here. Basically, I think what I want to say about this is that it is some really generic fantasy world building. It feels like a very generic fantasy young adult plot. The only thing that's really innovative about it is that it has a female-female romance between 2 princesses, and I think that by putting that in such a familiar type of book and story, this actually does a very good job of normalizing that narrative. So while I could nitpick a lot about this, about the world building and the plot, I actually do think this did basically exactly what it set out to do fairly well, and it was enjoyable. I did not want to put it down. I wanted to know what was going to happen, and I gave it 4 stars. If you want a comparison, I think that the fantasy world building and also how the fantasy kingdom intrigue plays out in this book reminded me of like Kristen Cashore's Graceling books. I think that's a solid point of comparison for the style of this writing. Okay, so there were 4 more books that I read in October. The first was Why We Broke Up by Daniel Handler with art by Myra Kalman. This is a young adult contemporary. As I mentioned in my TBR, I was compelled to read this for reasons not entirely of my own choosing, so I might just not have been the right audience for this book. There were things that I was pleasantly surprised with about it, but ultimately I felt like some of those things in the writing style and the approach to this story were ultimately tied for me with why it didn't work as a book. So really mixed feelings on this one. In case you're unaware, Daniel Handler is the author who is much more famous for writing middle grade books under the pen name Lemony Snicket. This is a very different sort of thing with these illustrations by Myra Kalman, and it's sort of meant to focus the book around these illustrations of like all of these objects. Basically the premise is that the protagonist, Min, short for Minerva, had gone through a breakup with this guy, Ed, and she is returning the box of all of the things that she accumulated over the course of their relationship to him with this letter. And the book is the letter that she is writing to Ed, where she ends up explaining basically all of their relationship in order to get to why it didn't work and why they broke up. So if you're able to suspend your disbelief that a teenager is going to write this entire novel by hand in one day, then this is actually a pretty interesting narrative device. The writing style is rambly, it feels very stream of conscious. I actually really like that. I think that's very divisive on this book, but I liked it. Min is this huge fan of like old classic films, except that all of the films referenced in this book are fictional. They don't really exist, so you get to kind of imagine what those movies that she's talking about might be. She's constantly dropping all these sort of cinematic references, and it feels like a sort of small, intimate story. It's centered around these, you know, objects, which are small, intangible things, and it's the chronicle of a fairly brief relationship. But despite all of that being really intriguing, I ended up having some pretty big problems with this book. The telling of the story sort of stems from this raw place of hurt for Min, and while it rang true for me on some levels, ultimately I felt like it lacked perspective. I think that a teenager reading this book might be able to see themselves in it, but they won't find much or any guidance. And for me, as a reader who is no longer a teenager reading this book, I felt like I was just mired in all of this teenage upset, and in some cases ignorance, without really feeling like the author was going to take care of me at the end of it. Because let's face it, teenagers don't know all the things. Hey, 20-somethings don't know all the things. You know, we read to learn more of the things about the world and how it works. But I feel like this book shows a lot of the teenage characters having kind of bad and unhealthy ways of thinking without showing something better. You could argue that there was an attempt at that. Ed, the guy Min is dating or has just broken up with, is pretty clearly an asshole, and she does call him out on some of his assholery. But Min herself is not really the most enlightened person. And there were some other things in this book that could, I think, be construed as problematic that don't get called out because the first-person narrator just isn't mature enough to know any better. But again, that's realistic, and I remember high school feeling that way, but I don't feel like it's helpful. And then, like, somewhere right towards the end, there's, like, this maybe 4-page rant that Min goes on of essentially like run-on sentences of deep self-loathing, and I felt like that was just a yucky note to end on, even if there is truth in the fact that sometimes teenagers feel like that. So yeah, some really mixed feelings on this one, and I gave it 2 stars. The next book I read was Lips Touch 3 Times by Laini Taylor. This is her collection of 3 novellas. Supposedly the running theme through this is that they all involve magical kisses. They do. I don't think I would have particularly noticed that as the unifying theme in this book if it hadn't been, you know, the title. The novellas in this book are Goblin Fruit, Spicy Little Curses Such as These, and Hatchling. I think, if I remember correctly, they get longer as they go. Hatchling is by far the longest. They all have illustrations by Jim DiBartolo, who is, I'm fairly certain, Laini Taylor's husband. The illustrations are really gorgeous. It took me a while to figure out what the illustrations were doing, though. There are several pages of full-page spread illustrations before each of the 3 novellas, and it took me a while to figure out that what was going on is that those illustrations were depicting some sort of backstory that is described somewhere within each of the novellas. I'm not sure that worked for me. I think I might have preferred it to be traditionally illustrated, but it was okay. My favorite of the 3 was the second of the novellas, Spicy Little Curses Such as These. The first one, Goblin Fruit, is supposedly like an updated take on the themes from the poem Goblin Market by Christina Rossetti. Kinda urban high school fantasy about a girl named Kizzy who comes from, you know, this sort of weird magical family commune, and she's sort of an outsider at school, and it's about goblins trying to tempt girls to give up their souls so they can drag their souls off to hell. And coming off of all of the teen angst of why we broke up, it wasn't really doing it for me. I was more interested, I think, in Kizzy's, like, weird magical family backstory than I was in what was actually going on. And that wasn't the focus of the story. Anyways, that story left me basically feeling a little yucky. Spicy Little Curses Such as These takes place in colonial India, and we start out with an old English woman having tea with a demon and bargaining for souls, and we eventually learn how this young girl ends up cursed, and it goes from there. So as I said, I liked this one, but I don't want to give too much of it away. The last one, Hatchling, which is the longest, is supposedly based on Zoroastrianism, loosely at least, and that is a subject I know absolutely nothing about. It's about a girl and her mother and some demons. Yeah, I think overall, in these three stories, you can see some of the, like, little seeds of things that are better developed in Laini Taylor's Daughter of Smoke and Bone trilogy. This wasn't as good for me, though, and I gave this collection 3 stars. And then the last 2 books I want to talk about that I read in October were both library books that have gone back to the library already. One of them was Embassytown by China Miéville. I'm not really going to talk about that here because I already did a full review of that book. I'm going to link it for you. It is sci-fi, it is dense, it is fascinating, it is about the essence of communication. I gave it 4 stars. The next one is Cold Comfort Farm by Stella Gibbons. This is a comedic English book from, like, the first half of the 20th century. I forget exactly which decade. Oops. It took me a while to really get into the spirit of the comedy of this book, but by the end I was finding everything absolutely hilarious. It's weird and quirky, though, but you know me, I like weird and quirky. It's basically spoofing popular fiction of the time and older sort of British Gothic stuff that takes place in the countryside where everything is gloom and doom. And it's about this young lady named Flora Post who is orphaned, and so she decides she's going to descend upon some distant relatives in the country who are living this, like, cursed doom and gloom lifestyle, and she decides she's just going to turn their life around. Interestingly, it says in the note at the beginning of this book that it takes place sometime in the near future, which is odd given how long ago it was written. I don't think it really affects how you read the book, but given that I was looking for it, there are some things that are like fictionalized historical events or like technology that's not quite exactly right. I didn't know quite what to think of that slant on the book from a modern perspective, but I enjoyed the comedy. I really did. It was kind of slow going for a while, though, while I got used to it. I know my mom was also reading this. I think she started it about the same time I did, and last I talked with her, she'd only read the first portion of the book, so I need to catch up with my mom again and ask if she's finished it and discuss. I think I put this book on my TBR a long time ago because I found it on a reading recommendation list from Robin McKinley's website, and then I've spent like the last year and a half trying to get my hands on my library's like one circulating copy of this book that went missing for a while and then it came back into circulation. Anyways, I finally read it. It was good timing, though, because I had recently read Precious Bane by Mary Webb, which is, I think, one of the books that Cold Comfort Farm is specifically spoofing. I enjoyed it that's kind of all. I gave it 4 stars. I got some laughs, especially from the ending. So that is all. Let me know if you've read any of these books, what you think, if you want to read any of these books, if you disagree with me, if you agree with me. I would love to chat. Please vote. That is all. Bye for now.